everyone. Thanks for joining us, joining here on time. For those that have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name's Jennifer Tasneem, and I'm the Career Services Coordinator in the Chemical Sciences Career Services Office. So as you know from the title of our workshop today, I'm going to be talking all about resumes, how to make a resume that is results-oriented, highlights your technical and transferable skills, and one that will help you leave a lasting impression on employers, whether you're applying to industry, whether you're applying to academia, all that kind of good stuff. So I want to talk a little bit today about the preparation that goes into putting together a resume or a CV. I'll also talk a little bit about the effective elements of a resume or a CV. So if you are wanting to have a good document, what things you need to keep in mind. And also towards the end, I'm going to be talking about some of the resources and services our office has to offer, and of course, some of the next steps for you all as we move forward from here. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to unmute yourself and ask me during any time of the presentation, but also remember that the presentation is recorded. You can also feel free to put them in the chat. Great. Okay. So to start off, you may be wondering, what really is the difference between the resume and the CV? In general, in the US, especially at the graduate level or even the postdoc level, those terms tend to be used very interchangeably. But in general, the resume is mostly used for applying to industry positions, and the CV is basically for everything else. So whether you're applying to academia, government, or even international positions. But that being said, that might also not be the case always. So sometimes companies that are based in Asia or in Europe, you'll find them use the term CV. But in the US, primarily industrial companies still might ask for a resume because that's more of an American term. But even then, some companies might just still ask for a CV. So as you can see, the terms are very interchangeably used. In terms of the technical differences, the main difference is about the page length. And there are a few other differences in terms of the content as well. But generally, for resumes at the industry level or applying to industry, your resume is usually about 2 pages. If you're applying to industry, CVs can technically be much longer, and they can be as long as you want, but also there are a few things that you need to keep in mind, and we'll talk about those later as well. So that's the basic difference. Whether you call it a resume or a CV, it doesn't really matter. It's pretty much the same thing. So when you're thinking about your resume or your CV, the main thing to keep in mind is that it's usually the first step that you have to take in your recruiting process or in your application process. So the main objective of your resume is getting to that interview stage. So your resume is basically your ticket to the interview. And there's no specific format or one true format that you should be following for a resume. But most importantly, it should be a document that is able to sell your best self to employers, but also one that truly represents you and reflects who you are. And while there are general guidelines that you should be following to make your resume or your CV, it should portray you and your abilities as best as you can. Okay, so in the recruiting process, as you can see, it doesn't really matter what type of an end goal you have, whether, again, if you're wanting to apply to the industry, in academic positions, or even working in government, the resume is usually used very early on in the process. And it's often the first document or the first thing you use to interact with the recruiter. And as you're kind of moving through each of the steps in the process, ultimately the goal of that resume is to get you moved through to the interview stage. And that's where you would be directly interacting with employers, either face-to-face during the interview session, besides maybe attending career fairs or company information application sessions. Thus, you want to be sure that you're communicating the main message that you're trying to get across. And that's going to vary a little based on the type of employer or the type of position that you're interested in or the area that you're planning to go into. But in general, that's kind of what you need to sort of think about before you even put together your resume, and that's how your document will be more and more effective. So thinking a little bit about the preparation stage of your resume, the very first thing you want to think about is kind of what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? And thinking about your weaknesses, it's not because you want to put those on your resume or you want to highlight your weaknesses. It's because you need to know what they are as you craft an effective document. So maybe you don't have any publications yet, or you have some in preparation. In that case, you want to maybe highlight some other things about your research experiences or some of your other accomplishments that might be more important to highlight to kind of sort of make up for that gap in the publication section. So but in some cases, having just one or two publications is even great, and it might be all you need, especially if you have published in a very high impact journal as the first author or something like that. And then the next thing you want to think about is your transferable skills from experiences that are going to be of interest to your potential employer. So maybe your previous research was in semiconductors, but you don't want to stay in that realm anymore after you graduate, but the skills that you obtain from that can still be important enough to apply to another type of industry or another field. So in that case, you're going to be talking less about the fact that you worked with semiconductors, you synthesize semiconductors, things like that, but focus more on some of the work that you actually did and talk about some of the transferable skills you learned, maybe by highlighting some of your instruments or techniques, more of those things. So you also want to be sure that you're focusing on the accomplishments that you have and highlight the results and outcomes. And you'll hear me say this a lot today. If you're not really focusing on the purpose of what you did or the so what aspect of the things you want to talk about, or what in talking about the accomplishments that you've done or achieved, it doesn't really matter how much information you put on your resume or have on your CV, because employers are more so interested in the impact of your work. Again, you also want to be sure that you're prioritizing what you want to include and what the employers are looking for. So that would be, what categories do you think are most important and what do you want to highlight? For most of you, especially for graduate students, the education section is often the first section that should be on the top of your resume or CV. But for postdocs, this might be a little bit different. Postdocs might want to bump their research experiences higher up as the first section, as opposed to having the education section at the top. Some postdocs might get around that by putting the postdoc as an additional education section, and that's totally fine as well. But after the education section, you definitely must highlight your research, your work experience, because that's typically the bulk of where you spend your time on as a grad student or as a postdoc. So you also want to think about the skills and experiences your potential employer is looking for. And the best way to do this is when you're applying to a job posting, go back to the job description and look at the required skills that the employer is seeking. Do you have all of those skills that they're looking for? You don't also need to be 100% match for all the skills they're looking for in order to apply. But if you have some of those skills, try to incorporate those keywords and keywords as much as you can through your experiences and through your bullet points. You also do need to personalize your resume or your CV for the type of position that you're applying for. And I mentioned this before as well. So sometimes we might have students who are kind of still in between whether they want to go into academia or whether they want to go into industry. But based on the two different positions, the two documents that they're going to need for their application, are going to be very different. So in this case, the student might benefit by having two versions of their resume, one for academia and one for industry. So it's really important to think about the relevance of the information you have on your resume and use that to portray what the employer is looking for. So there are some general guidelines, obviously, for resumes that you should be following, even for CVs. And these are some pretty basic ones. So be consistent, and I'll go into more details about this in the next few slides, and follow the same type of formatting, whatever formatting you choose to follow in between each of the sections. So use short bullet points that are concise to describe your contributions and your accomplishments. And make sure your resume is professional. If you have your email address on the top in your contact information, preferably using the @Illinois email address would be good here. And make the best use of the space that you have available for each of the pages. So as I mentioned before, for industry, you need to keep it to 2 pages. So you need to think about what information would portray my best self for this position that I'm applying for. And keep positions that are most relevant to the job that you're looking for. Don't put anything on there that might not lead you up to getting that position and doesn't portray your best skills and expertise. So another really important to keep in mind is obviously all your information, especially the positions in between each of the sections, have to be listed in reverse chronological order. So most recent experiences will be highest up. And use easy to read fonts, no cursive or complicated looking fonts, and use just one font style throughout each of the sections. Again, some of the simple things: use action verbs to start the bullet points descriptions of the positions, and we'll talk about this in more detail. And lastly, don't forget to proofread. Don't rely on your word spell checkers. They might not catch all the grammar errors or some of the missing words that you might have. Okay. So again, I wanted to reiterate that consistency is key on your resume or your CV. No matter what type of employer or position you're applying to, these are some of the things that you need to keep in mind. So for example, under your education section, if you've listed your degree title first and then your institution name, make sure you list your position title first and then your organization or company name the second in your experience section. And you could also list it the other way around, where you list your institution first and then the degree title. In that case, the experience section should also follow the same type of formatting. So if you choose to bold your institution name, make sure you do it throughout the other sections as well. So whatever you do, keep it consistent, because that allows just for better readability of your document, and also demonstrate your attention to detail, which, as you know, as scientists, it's really important to demonstrate that. Again, formatting also means the font size, the font styles that you use. So anything between a 10 to 12 point font is fine, but try not to use different font sizes throughout your resume. So the top of your resume where you put your name, it's totally fine. That has to be obviously the biggest font throughout your resume. And your section titles can also be a little bit bigger, but in terms of the content that you have under each section, try to keep the font size for each of those information the same. That's because, again, you don't really want your document to look cluttered. The spacing might look different, so just things to keep in mind. Again, as I mentioned about spacing, keep the spacing between each position and bullet points across the sections the same. You don't want single spacing here, double spacing there. It doesn't really look very visually appealing if you do something that way. Also, keep your resume as simple as possible. There's no need for any colors, tables, or any icons, whatever the case might be. So again, as I mentioned, for resumes, for industry, limit your page length to 2 pages, and technically as long as you want for anything else, but generally an employer or a recruiter will only read the first 3 pages of your document with the most interest. So you want to make sure that the most powerful sections and the most important information is on those first 3 pages. And you can go as long as you want, but just keep in mind that a recruiter may get tired and lose interest after a while. So another really important thing to remember is that your page breaks need to be clean and neat. And what I mean by this is that it's okay to have multiple pages and it's okay to split up a section. For example, a research section where you have 3 or 4 positions and continue the research section onto a second page, but try not to split an individual position over a page break. So for example, if you have multiple bullet points under a position that you're not able to fit in the first page, either move the entire position on the second page or maybe even shorten the bullet points so that it fits on the first page. But don't continue it onto the second page in between each of the individual positions. But as I mentioned, it's okay for you to continue the research section where you have 3 to 4 positions onto the second page. But if you do that on the second page, make sure you write the name of the title, so the research experience continued onto the second page. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, please feel free to let me know. Finally, you want to have your name on every page of your document. Your first page already has your name on the top, so you don't need that, don't need to repeat that. But from the second page onward, have your full name, your page number somewhere either in the footer or the header of the page. Okay, some resume don'ts to think about. Well, don't include any photographs and images or personal information such as race, gender, etc. Now, this again might be a little bit different if you're looking for positions abroad, but in the US, typically that stuff is not required. And when it comes to listing the bullet points under each position, don't write any personal pronouns such as I, me, we, etc. And when you talk about your tasks, don't write them in paragraph descriptions. Have bulleted lists to describe your contributions in a position. Also, something to think about is don't include any unusual abbreviations that an employer might be unfamiliar with. So instrument abbreviations, for example, like TEM, SEM, NMR, those things are fine. But if you're including any student organizations under maybe your leadership experiences, make sure you have the full form written first, and then maybe have the abbreviation in parentheses if you need to refer to it later. So for example, if you're on the Women Chemist Committee, don't just include WCC first, because an employer might be unfamiliar with the abbreviation. Also, references are not required on your CV or your resume. You can create a separate document where you list all your references, list all their contact information, things like that, but just keep it separate from your resume or your CV because that will take up additional space and pages. Also, again, as I mentioned before, don't use any tables, icons, fancy colors. Don't try to use a template or multiple columns on your resume. Just keep it as simple as possible. Unless you really physically hand your document to a recruiter for review, a lot of times bigger industrial companies will run your resumes through a software called the applicant tracking system. So things like columns and tables, even though they might look visually pleasing, they might not work well with ATS. And a lot of companies do use these ATS systems to scan and parse resumes to rank and screen candidates. So if you have tables and columns, the ATS, they don't really pick up those information well, and your information can get totally scrambled. So it's easier, oops. So it's easier if you just make a Word document, make your own template, but don't use any of those invisible tables or columns. Okay, so what are some of the required resume categories? And I'll go into more detail about each of these sections as well. But at the very top of your resume and on the very first page, you want to make sure that you're keeping the most important information. So at the very top, obviously, you'll need your contact information, your personal information like name, your email, phone number, things like that. That goes at the very top. And then comes the education section. That's usually, as I mentioned, the most important thing for a grad student, can even be for a postdoc, because that's kind of what defines you as a student. And then your experience section will come next. And this can just be maybe your research experience, or if you want to make an experience section that that has all your other experiences combined, such as your teaching experiences, all that stuff. It can be a combined section as well. So other sections that are also can be included, you should include is an objective or a summary or a highlight section. And this can also go at the very top before your education section. And we'll go into more detail about this as well. If you have publications and presentations and even patents, make a section for that, but also remember to highlight your name when you include that. As I mentioned before as well, your teaching experience, you can make a separate section for that. If you are applying to industry and had previously some industry experience or work experience before pursuing your grad degree, maybe in your undergrad you had an internship at a company, you can choose to separate that out in another section. Additionally, you can have leadership and your activities section, your volunteer experiences, your honors and awards, and the skills section, which also I'm going to be talking about in more detail. But again, the most important thing to keep in mind is focus on your accomplishments and highlight your outcomes. Be as specific as you can about the skills and techniques that you used in each of these sections as you describe the positions, and don't just write a plain job description type of a resume where you just talk about the tasks that you've done. Okay, so going into more detail about into each of these sections, the heading section where you include your contact information. So obviously it has to be at the very top. So things to include are your name, your email address, your phone number. Also include your residential address, so a personal home address and not your lab address, whether if you have an office in Noise or RAL, because your resume or your CV is your personal document. So it has to have your home address or your personal address. A lot of times people will include their home address that's not in Urbana-Champaign. So if you're, for example, from New York and you're looking for positions in that area, you might find that it's helpful to demonstrate that you're from there. But to be honest, at the grad level, it really doesn't matter that much because companies will relocate you for the position that you're getting into. Again, also at the very top of in your contact information section, a lot of students also include their LinkedIn profile link. So as long as your profile is updated and error-free, you can also include a link to your profile. Again, also, as I mentioned, full name should be on every page. Well, 90% of your times, your documents will be saved electronically, but in the case that employers print your resume, it's easy to recognize pages if they get mixed up in a pile if you have your full name and your page numbers. So yeah. as I mentioned before, also up to you if you choose to include an objective statement or a highlight section. It's not really required, especially if you write a one-line objective that's kind of vague and doesn't necessarily add value to your resume. But in the case that you're thinking about shifting gears or career paths, it might be helpful. So for years and years, if you've done research and development or bench work or done research in the lab, but now you maybe want to move into science policy or science communication or even consulting, it might be a good idea to have an objective statement that really demonstrates kind of the disparity of your previous experiences. But again, with that objective statement, it should be focused on what you can do for the employer. So an objective like, I'd like to get a job as a research scientist in the chemical engineering field, it's very vague and not really informative because you're talking about more so what you want. Instead, you could say something like, utilize synthesis skills or use X or Y instrument skills to do such and such in a process engineering role, or something along those lines that is more specific and talks about what you can contribute to the company, what you're going to be bringing to the table, or how you can help them, as opposed to what you're looking for. So I hope you hope that makes more sense. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free to let me know. So about the contact information sections, here's two simple formats that you could use. In the first one, you can see the name is in the middle, the address is on one side, and the email and phone number is on one side. One other could be where you have the address and email and phone number all on the same lines. Again, this is not necessarily what you have to follow, but also good formats to keep in mind. Okay, so do you have any questions at this point? Feel free again to put them in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, with the rise of ORCID IDs, I'd assume that'd be a good thing to include. Would that be better in the personal information or in with the publication section?
Yeah, that's a good question. Either places is fine since the ORC ID is more relevant for your publications. It might be a good idea to include it under the publication section, somewhere below the title at the very beginning. But if you choose to include it in your personal information at the very top, that's also fine. Yeah, either is fine. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the education section. So obviously for anyone at the University of Illinois, especially graduate students, I would highly recommend putting the education section on top to demonstrate your degree, your field of study, your graduation date, all that kind of good stuff. And even if you're a postdoc and you did your degree somewhere else, it's totally fine to put your education as your #1 section. But if you worked for quite a while in your postdoc, you might want to put your work or your research experience ahead of your education section. That can vary, again, on an individual basis. So if you have questions about that, we can talk more about it later. So again, in the education section, you want to include your degree, your field of study, both for your graduate degree and your undergraduate degree, along with your graduation dates, and then GPA. This is also a very contested topic. Some employers actually do care about your GPA. A lot of times you might hear that no one cares about your grad GPA, but to be honest, some employers still do. So I would recommend if you have a GPA above a 3.5 or 3.6 in grad school to definitely put it on your resume. If it's lower than that, you can choose to leave it off, but in that case, also leave off your undergrad GPA, or else it might look a little strange that you have it for one, don't have it for the other. Again, consistency is key. We usually tell our undergraduate students to include their GPA if it's above a 3.0. So that's something to think about for your undergrad GPA. So the education section is another place where you can demonstrate some of your relevant skills. And this you can do by mentioning your thesis title, for example. If you're close to graduation and have a working title for your thesis, you can also choose to include that here. And even along with your advisor's name. One other category that you can also include here is a certifications category. So if besides your PhD, you're also pursuing a certification, some grad students I know do a certificate in either business or entrepreneurship, or even a teaching certificate, you can also include it here along with your completion dates. So here's again a basic example for the education section. As you can see at the very top, there's the current degree at the very first with the degree title, the field of study, the institution name, the location, and the graduation dates and the GPAs. Again, this doesn't necessarily have to look like this, but it's sort of an example to demonstrate that everything is consistent and how it would look like. So whatever format you choose, keep it consistent throughout. Okay, moving on to the experience section. The experience section honestly can take on a lot of different forms, and it's variable again based on the positions that you're seeking. Some people choose to put all three, whether they have research experience, teaching experience, full-time industry or work experience, all together and make a combined section. So for example, if you, as an undergrad, maybe did an internship, you can choose to include that and make an all-encompassing experience section. But again, depending on the type of position you're applying for, you can choose to separate each of those information out. So if you're applying to industry and had prior industry experience, either through full-time work, through internships, you definitely should pull out that information and highlight that in a separate section. And if you're a postdoc and you're applying to maybe a primarily undergraduate institution that focuses more on teaching, you need to focus more and more on your teaching skills. You can also put your teaching skills even higher up before your research experience if you've had multiple teaching roles. Another example is if you're maybe interested in science communication, what positions or experiences can you pull higher up to demonstrate those communication skills besides your research? Sometimes for applying to industry, grad students tend to think that teaching experience might not be as relevant in industry, but they still might. So especially if you've had teaching experiences either with first years or with non-majors, such as if you've taught general chemistry for non-majors, and in the position that you're interested for, you're going to be working with clients that are non-scientists, that teaching and communication skill can still be important to mention. So again, thinking about those transferable skills which are relevant. So yeah, you can also include separate sections for your leadership experiences, either in your committees or through the RSOs or any volunteer experiences that you've had. So just like you did for your education section, the information such as your position title, your employer or the organization name, the location and the dates need to be consistent throughout. Okay, so the other thing to think about for your experience section is when you describe your position, always list your responsibilities and your contributions in bullet point format. So list them out rather than writing big paragraphs that are harder to follow. And typically each position should have about 3 to 4 bullet points, and you should start each of your bullet point with an action verb. For example, performed, synthesized, collaborated, things like that. But if some of those individual bullet points get too long, maybe 3 or 4 lines, definitely you can split those into additional bullet points as well. And I know sometimes it might be a little hard to do that as you write, the complicated chemical names or even the instruments that you use. But as much as possible, try to keep those readable and to the point. So I always tell students that there are three main components to a complete bullet point. So don't just talk about what you do in your research or in a position. You really want to focus on the outcomes, quantify any results or any outcomes wherever possible, and highlight your accomplishments while also talking about the skills and techniques that you use to get to the outcome. So a bullet point basically should have the what, where you talk about your tasks and contributions, and also the how, where you incorporate some of those instruments and those techniques that you used, and then finally focusing on highlighting the why, so by mentioning the purpose of what you did or highlighting specific outcomes. So again, instead of just saying that you synthesize something, also mention what is the purpose of that synthesis or what you're hoping to accomplish. So for example, synthesize X and Y nanocomposites using a vapor diffusion method in order to maybe determine efficiency of a solar cell using combinations of nanocomposites or something along those lines that's really specific. Again, as I mentioned, your experience section also depends based on the positions that you're applying for, you can list your volunteer opportunities combined, especially if you're looking for a position or applying for a position maybe where research is not the main focus. So if you're interested in going into consulting and worked in the Illinois Business Consulting RSO or IBC, and you had a significant role there, your volunteer experience in IBC can still be super beneficial and can be higher up and highlighted in the experience section. Okay. So here I'm showing you an example of a very basic experience section of one of the positions, the research position in the experience section, that's not really that great. It's a very basic one that's kind of talking, just listing the tasks and the studies, and it doesn't really go into too much details about the techniques or the accomplishments that this person had. Whereas when you're looking at this example, that's more accomplishment based. So here they're showing me what they actually did, how they did it, and the why. So they quantified some things, like for example, in the third bullet point, they mentioned trained two new graduate students and 3 undergraduate students on laboratory skills, things like that. Use Monte Carlo simulations to model interactions of ozone with water droplets. So the more you can do that, the more specific you can be about those skills and techniques, it's going to be beneficial, or it's going to be more impactful for any type of employer, whether you're going into academia or government or industry. So here's another example of a pretty bad resume that has a lot of errors. So I'd love to get some thoughts and feedback from some of you all. So if you take some time to take a look at this, you can feel free to unmute yourself or put some of your thoughts in the chat, especially based on the things that I talked about. So what are you noticing here?
Like his format is not consistent. Like in the first section, for the UIUC one, it has GPA, but for the Northwestern one, it doesn't have GPA.
Yes, absolutely. Consistency, super important. So GPA, there's a GPA for Illinois, but not a GPA for their undergrad. What else? Okay, So there's also a lot of typos besides all of the formatting stuff. So as you can see in the email address, the Illinois is spelled differently. In the chat, someone mentioned font is not consistent. Absolutely, there's different fonts in the GPA part, all that stuff. Also, for when you look at the section titles, you'll see that activities, and that's also spelled wrong. So activities is not capitalized, but the other sections are. There's a weird colon after the experience section, but there's not anything, that's not the case anywhere else. So you can see the degree title and the field is underlined for Illinois, but that's not the case for the undergrad. There's a big paragraph in experience instead of bullet points. Yes, absolutely. And also in the bullet points, as you can see, there's a lot of these personal pronouns. So I was responsible, I trained, things like that. So you always want to remember that whenever you're writing these bullet points, you write them in the third person without using any personal pronouns. Okay, so yes, fonts are different, no underlining here. Also for the activities section, you can see the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, it's italicized, the other one is not, and there's not really any bullet point description to go into more detail into that. So yeah, all those things to keep in mind. And also there's no graduation date for Illinois. I think that's super important for any position that you're looking for or applying for. Okay, great. So this, as you can see, it's a much better, it's a cleaner resume. You'll see that there are bulleted descriptions under each of the positions, not just the experience section, but also the activities, the leadership experiences. The formatting is consistent. So in the first line here, there's the degree title. On the second line, there's the institution name and the location, and that's the case all throughout in each of the different sections. So yeah. All right, and so moving on, there are some other sections, as I mentioned, that you also could highlight and you definitely should highlight. So I wanted to talk a little bit more into detail about that. So the publications, presentation, and patent section is one. So if you have patents and you're applying to industry, I would absolutely recommend making a separate section just for the patents, because in industry, that's a big deal. In many cases, depending again on the employer that you're going into, you might not publish again, you might not be writing journal articles again, but you might still have patents. So other employers, they might still care about publishing, and you will continue to publish even after you go into the workforce. But certainly for academia, you'll be publishing no matter what. So again, you need to highlight all those information. So depending on your personal preference and based on each of the categories you're going into, either academia or industry, you need to have separate sections or either combined for the publications, presentations, and the patents. So no matter what, making sure that you're including the full citations and that you're highlighting your name in the citations that you write. So include details such as all the author names, the journal, the page number, the volume, the year of publishing, all that kind of information, but also remember to highlight your name. And you can do this by bolding your name. You can also underline, but again, sometimes underlining is not that ATS friendly, so bolding is a safer option. So there's a lot of discussion whether to include publications that are submitted versus manuscripts that are in preparation. And to be honest, it's also fine to include a citation for a manuscript that's in preparation, as long as you have a working title and have a list of authors and you can include the citation. But also at the end, make sure you're clarifying whether it's a manuscript in preparation, whether it's submitted. If it's published, you can include the full citation. So just specify at the end, no matter what the case. Another thing to think about also is if you've been super successful in your academic or your postdoc journey where you've had many, many publications, you might also need to shorten your list if that's necessary, especially if you're applying for industry positions, thinking about the 2-page limit. Thinking about how much space you have remaining and how many you want to include, maybe include the most impactful journals that you've written or submitted. So you can shorten lists if necessary, but again, also if you do choose to shorten your list, make sure you're writing the total number of publications or patents that you have. So you can do that by mentioning 5 of 20 or 5 of 15, whatever the case might be. Okay, and then moving on to the skills section, as I mentioned before, I wanted to go into a little bit more detail into this. For the skills section, again, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but I always recommend, as much as possible, try to incorporate your techniques, your skills you used as much as possible within the bullet points of when you describe them under your experience section, and incorporate them as much as possible within that. But again, as it's understandable, as graduate students and postdocs, you might use so many different instruments, so many different techniques that if you choose to incorporate a lot of them, your bullet points can get too long, it can get too convoluted and confusing. And in that case, you can make a totally separate skills section as well at the end where you can incorporate some of that information. So for the skill section, you can have different categories. So there can be a laboratory category where you can incorporate your instrument, your techniques that you are familiar with. Another category can be a computer section. Here you can be talking about some of your programming skills, your data analysis tools and software, things like that. Another category, it's optional, but you could also choose to include is a foreign languages section. With the other instruments, either in laboratory or computer, you don't necessarily need to write your proficiencies, but with foreign languages, I would probably recommend including the proficiency after each of the languages that you specify, either in parentheses or brackets. So whether you're a beginner or intermediate, fluent, whatever the case, definitely mention that for languages. Also, any other technical skills or certifications that you might have. So for engineers, sometimes you might be taking a project management certification, things like that, you can also include under the skills section. But also something to think about is some of your soft skills, like your leadership skills, your teamwork, your communication. Don't include that in a category under the skills section. It would be more beneficial and more helpful if you incorporate those skills within the bullet points of your previous position. So if you want to highlight your teamwork and your communication skills, you can choose to do that either through your research experience or your teaching experiences, where you can highlight some of those leadership and teaching skills. So again, here's an example of a sample skill section. The different categories here are the lab, computer, and the languages skills, and you can just list them one by one, separated with commas. Okay, So moving on to another additional section, you can have a leadership experience or activity section. Again, just like I mentioned before, consistency is super important, and you've heard me say this already many times, but list your leadership experiences consistently as the other section. So here, if you're involved in multiple organizations, if you've listed your degree title in your education section first, also choose to write the position title in the leadership experiences. Also, if you're involved in multiple organizations, you can choose the positions that might be most relevant or related to the positions that you might be applying for. Again, it's really important to not just list each of the leadership positions that you've had, but using some of those bullet points to be more specific about your role and describe your role. Also, rank sections by importance to the career objective. I mentioned this before, thinking about the relevance and what story you're trying to portray through your resume. Also, reverse chronological order is really important to think about. Again, as I mentioned before, try not to write any abbreviations. So any abbreviations of RSOs or organizations, definitely write those out. Also, another section, the honors and awards, again, arranging this in reverse chronological order. Here you can include any scholarships, any fellowships, any honors that you've had either through your undergrad or even grad school, definitely grad school, any departmental awards, any travel grants that you've received for going into conferences, things like that. Also mentioning the dates of when you received this under each institution, specifying those. So that's kind of all the information that I have for you in terms of the different sections. If you have any specific questions about each of the sections or each of the content, feel free to let me know, either unmute yourself or put them in the chat. But also, as I mentioned before, I wanted to mention a little bit about some of the ways that our office can help you as you're drafting your resume or as you're going into the job search process. So here are some of the services that we offer. And I really wanted to highlight the resume, the CV cover letter reviews, especially since that's most relevant for this workshop. So if you don't really have time for an actual appointment, you can also feel free to email your draft to our office, and our careers email, careers@scs.illinois.edu. You can email us here and we'll get back to you as soon as we can, definitely within 2 to 3 business days, and give you feedback electronically. So if you also have any other questions about the whole job search or career planning process, feel free to use your Handshake at Illinois account to schedule appointments with us.